Do you see a person I don't know?
We're gonna use the power.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly. So it's to either go or study or take a class or not, it's just nice to like have a social circle. It's really critical. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll take you. I can't remember the
name. I'll remember it. Yeah, and Steven went back on his pen, like city of
and then Everybody, thank you for coming. I'll move over so I can be on the camera too. And thank you for those joining us from our home audience. We are thrilled today to have 3 of our faculty members here to facilitate a discussion. And as I understand, it really is a discussion today around social justice and critical race theory. As we do at all of our departmental events, I wanted to start by reading our land acknowledgement, and then we'll introduce ourselves so we're aware of who's in the room so we can learn from each other. So our land acknowledgement is that we within the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at Florida State University acknowledge our university is located on the indigenous lands of the Appalachian Nation, the Muscogee Creek Nation, the Miccosukee Tribe of Florida, and the Seminole Tribe of Florida. We highlight and pay respect to this history because we understand how the state of Florida and Florida State University came to be settled on these lands. We recognize this land is scarred with a painful past of enslavement, settler colonial violence, the desolation of culture, and the forced removal of indigenous bodies. Despite this, we respect the cultural and ceremonial practices these indigenous nations maintain in and around Tallahassee today. As educators, we honor the knowledge of these tribes and their people and acknowledge that indigenous students, faculty, and administrators are vital to Florida State University. We embrace the decolonization of our educational system and commit to disrupting suppressive systems through explorations of many truths and lived experiences, and creating room for those who are often excluded by harmful colonial erasures in our practice and pedagogy. So with that, I once again want to welcome everyone. What we'll do is briefly introduce ourselves. We'll go around the room here in person first, and then we'll have everybody online if you'd like to say something as well. I'll go first. We'll just give our name and our affiliation in our program. So I'm Toby Park-Gagan, as most many of you know, associate professor here in the Ed Policy and Evaluation program. Let's start over there, and we'll go around this way.
Hi, I'm Christine Walker. I'm a faculty member of higher education.
Hi, I'm Lauren Wagner. I am a second-year PhD student in curriculum instruction. Hi, I'm Anna Eves, and I'm a doctoral student of the mathematics education program. Hi, I'm Mother Let's
go to Melba next, and we'll stick around.
Hi, I'm Nova Merck Velasquez. I am a doctoral candidate in the IME program. I'm Emily Leava, and I'm a doctoral candidate in the IME program as well. Ayesha, second year PhD student.
Hi, I'm Amber Mustafa. I'm a second year PhD student in the IM.
Hello everyone, my name is Derek. I am a first year student in the higher education PhD program.
Hi everyone, I'm Laura Vaughn, and I'm a first year doc student in the higher education program.
Hi everyone, I'm Brittany, first year doctoral candidate in the higher education program.
Hello everyone, Juan Edwards, third year PhD student in the higher education program.
Hi everyone, my name is Gaurav Parshi, and I'm in the second year of the Master's in Higher Ed program.
My name is Khurshid. I'm first year doctoral student in the IME program.
My name is Sean Salem. I'm a first year PhD student in the IME program.
And Sung Kim, first year PhD student at the IME program.
Stacey Rutledge, faculty member, educational leadership.
Alonzo Gilzine, faculty member, Education and Leadership Policy.
Michael Paul, third year doc student, EPE program.
PhD
Alex Moran, second year PhD student in the EPE program.
And if anyone on Zoom would like to introduce themselves, you're welcome to do so now. You can unmute yourself and feel free.
Hi, Sheila Lavisiere. I'm a doctoral candidate in the Education Policy and Evaluation program. Hello.
Hi, I'm Brittany Clausen-Pitts. I'm a fifth year doc student in the IME program.
I'm Warren Oliver. I'm a doctoral candidate in the IME program.
Hi, I'm going to present myself. I'm Eugene Hernandez. I work in the Office of Institutional Research, and I'm also a grad student of statistics, but I'm here to learn. So thank you.
I'll follow Eugene. I'm Samantha Nix. I'm the Assistant Director of Institutional Research here at FSU. And I was a graduate of the PhD higher ed program.
I'll follow you, Sam. I'm Lauren. I'm also in the Office of Institutional Research. I'm a student success analyst.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mia Hines. I'm an academic advisor in the School of Teacher Education in Oasis, and I'm also a doctoral student in the Educational Leadership and Policy Studies program.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, Sierra. I'm Sally Watkins. I am a product of the PhD program in the higher education area, and I also teach in leadership studies.
Hey everybody, my name is Sierra Griffin. I'm a doctoral candidate in the Ed Leadership EDD program. Here to learn. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is Holly Henning, and I'm a first year in the higher education program, PhD, and glad to be here.
Hi, I'm Sherry Sutherland. I'm a professor in the School of Teacher Education. I do science education.
Hello, my name is Victor Kasper. I'm a doctoral candidate in science education.
Hello, everyone. Eric Ludwig here, Director of the Online EDD and Teaching Faculty in ELPS.
Hello, Stephanie Zilkowski, Faculty in ELPS.
Hi, I'm Sierra Randy, and I'm a second year doc student in Science Ed.
Hello.
I'm Leah Register, and I am a master's student in Ed Policy.
Hello, I'm Madeline.
Sorry, Madeline.
You go, Carrie.
Thanks. Carrie Wall, Masters in IME.
And I'm Madeline. I'm a master's in EPE.
Hello, I'm Shaonan Zhang. I'm first year PhD student at IME.
Hello, this is Xiaoshen Li. I'm a third year PhD student in IME program.
Great, thank you. And I'm pleased to have so many folks joining us via Zoom today. So we have a large classroom here today. Without further ado, though, I'll introduce you all to my esteemed colleagues, Dr. Ayesha Khurshid, Chris Small, and Cameron Beatty, and turn things over to them.
Good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started. Also, just reassuring that we have so many different cross sections of backgrounds that are participating today. It says a lot, not only about the relevance and the importance of the topic that we're kind of discussing and having some dialogue with, but also the intersectionality that plays along with so many different areas. So we're going to start this afternoon with a Jamboard activity. We passed out some post-it notes that are around on some of your tables that you can help with writing. That's fine if you have a device. The link is here. But in essence, what we want everyone to do for us is tell us at this point just what is critical race theory, what do you currently know about the topic, what you think it means, anything that you would like to share if you're not familiar with Jamboard. It's very similar to just a post-it note, and so all of you are able to add post-it note, being able to like to write it down with the link to add to it. We want to kind of start framing our dialogue around what's currently out there in terms of your understanding of it. So this will kind of help us to kind of get like from the audience perspective, what do we currently know about it and what it is?
Chris, can you go back to the slide? What we'll do is, for those of you at home, we'll put it in the chat here in just a second.
Advice you can use that should take you straight to the Jamboard, or if you're more comfortable with writing, that works also.
If you are able to potentially speak louder, they're kind of having some issues on Zoom right now. Yeah. Yes.
Another sequence?
Yeah.
Got it. The second time I did it, it took me a minute. Do you want me to email you the link? No.
Thank you.
Promise you, set the link out. Are you guys able to access it at all?
Yeah, just for the view only. So I think if you can change it to edit, then we can.
Yeah.
Other, waiting for the link. Love to hear your thoughts about what comes to mind when you hear CRT, critical race theory. What immediately comes to mind?
Race.
Race. Yeah. Race comes to mind. What else? Structural and institutional racism. Okay. Talk about both of those, of course.
Politics.
Politics online. Resistance.
Historical treatment of people of color.
There's a historical context, right? Historical treatment of people of color.
Restructuring our current and to include everyone instead of only the heteronormative kind of, well, not heteronormative, but hegemonic. There we go.
There you go.
Structure.
Right. So there's a restructuring with the outcome of thinking about what does inclusivity looks like for all people, especially those that have been marginalized or disadvantaged.
We have a lack of understanding, investigating power, white supremacy, and uncomfortable history.
Uncomfortable history. It's loaded, huh? Yep. Critical analysis, right? And there's an analysis part of critical race theory that we'll also talk about.
The fact that the word theory is there means that it's not a new idea, it's an accepted thing by a majority of people.
I don't know if it's accepted by the majority, but it's it's been well known in academic settings, legal settings. We'll also talk about that, right? It scares some people, which we know. Talk about that as well. You might want to think about what makes it a theory. Alex?
Evidence to support.
Okay, right? People have looked, made an argument, and said, hey, this is the outcome that we got from the argument of thinking about this theory in these different contexts. We'll talk about those contexts here in a second as well. Anything else online?
Theorized way to view, discuss, and understand race relations, expanding the lens through which we view our history, specific to higher ed. Controversy is a new one.
Okay. What's so controversial about it? What's so messy about it?
Nobody wants to secede their privilege.
Who's no one?
Nobody
in this room?
No, not nobody. You're right. The people who have historically been in power, so white males, and that is not obviously every white male, but the existing structure.
Okay. So those that have been benefited from the power structure that's been set up. Okay. Thank you.
Really like threats and challenges, sort of like colorblind ethos that really was really troubling in my education, growing up in the 80s and 90s. So it really challenges this very widespread ethos of the equality means colorblind.
Right? That colorblind ideology that Dr. King told us we should not be judged by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character. So we are doing everything right because I do not see color, right? And the idea of taking an analysis threatens that concept when it's framed that way.
It's taking away the sugar coating of history where it's like, oh, well, you know, we had Thanksgiving where like the settlers and the Indians, they all got together and they had a great feast and everything was fine. Never mind that there was like, you know, simply genocide.
Right, we need to be comfortable with celebrating our history. This is a great country. When we teach something off of that path, then we're making our students uncomfortable, or our students can't handle that, right? Their minds are too young. They can't think about, we can't make students feel uncomfortable, or they've taken more privilege than other students, right?
We've captured quite a few. I think all of these that we'll touch upon and or continue to discuss. I think the great thing about this topic is that it doesn't have an ending space. So as we continue to kind of delve into the work, giving us those opportunities to have the dialogue. And so a few objectives that we want to cover in terms of outlining the discussion and moving forward. And so one, of course, discussion of critical race theory and what it means and some of the history. We also plan to review some of the recent terms and legislation. I think that was a big piece of embarking on this journey, looking at some of the recent legislation that's come out specifically for the state of Florida, but also pieces of legislation that you may not be aware of that are also under consideration for the upcoming legislative year, and then implications for not only K through 12, but also institutions of higher education. Engaging in reflective thinking about the intersections of social justice and critical race theory. And so some discussion about how do these theories and these perspectives intersect with our work, the practitioner standpoint in terms of, and I know we have some individuals from teacher ed as well. And so looking at how does it not only impact our student population, but also from faculty standpoint in terms of our research and what we're doing, how do we continue to cultivate that and also support that moving forward. And then finally, we have some plans for some follow-up items in terms of some survey materials. And so part of our intent of today is to gather information from our audience as well in terms of how do we proceed from here. And so once this seminar ends, what do we do tomorrow? What do we do for next semester? And how do we continue to have this dialogue moving forward? And so we hope to also have some follow-up items that will entail not only survey material, but also possibly some focus groups and collecting some information on interest in those focus groups. In terms of terminology, and so another piece that we discussed when preparing for today was making sure we were clear about some of the definitions that you'll hear. And so critical race theory, we talked a little bit about it in some of our conversation earlier, but a framework through which researchers and scholars use to try to understand how structural and racial inequities exist and endure in our society. And that being, of course, in contrast to the idea that critical race theory is reverse racism, or that it is perpetuating a racist cycle. And so we'll clarify and expound upon what that theoretical framework is, a little bit of the history behind it, and how to further understand that in comparison to some of the arguments about it being racist. So what is race? Another term that we wanted to kind of share in terms of what that term means. And we hear this a lot. And so one of the pieces that I think even from my own experience, we kind of hear that race is this fixed aspect that goes back to your makeup. And so through research, we understand that race is not based upon phenotype. And so biologically speaking, scientifically speaking, there are no differences there. And so it becomes those areas of looking at how these were socially constructed and the historical context by which race was developed. I'm also thinking about the origination of the geographical locations of individuals based upon phenotype. And these became structural ways in which races were differentiated and categorized in order to move forward. And so that concept of race being something that we socially construct in terms of how we develop and the outlooks that we have on what race means to us each and every day. Some other provisional definitions of culture versus race. And so this idea that culture stems from systems of meaning that guide social action. So these are shared beliefs that are passed down within a group of individuals. In contrast to race, that becomes these cultural structures that we put in place in ranking of individuals based upon phenotype or based upon our perspective of how they look. Multiculturalism, another definition that we'll kind of walk through a little bit as well. This calls us to recognize rather than ignore cultural differences and how we frame the diversity that exists around us. Anti-racism, another definition and term that we'll slightly discuss today as well. The stance that seeks to actively challenge and dismantle race, racialization and racial inequality. And so anti-racism, again, one of those buzzwords that we hear and sometimes can lead you down a path of, let me stay away from anti-racism. But in fact, understanding that it isn't a avenue by which we talk about race and what it means in the history of it, and how we begin to further understand it in order to move forward.
You all passed the quiz, right? It sounds like you have a understanding or context, some of us, of what critical race theory is, right? And I think that's important, right? Because I think what's happened is if you don't have an understanding, then if you hear something from media or you hear something taken out of context, that starts to frame how we make meaning of critical race theory in education, which we all know can be problematic, right? We don't have a grounding in what are we talking about, what are we engaging in, what are people afraid of, and what are people fighting for to be centered in, or taking a lens of thinking about a curriculum. So spot on with the theoretical framework, it's also an analytical framework, right? And really thinking about it, it came out of legal studies, for those of you that like some historical background and thinking about Derek Bell and other scholars are saying, hey, we can't just look at a law and say that this law applies to everyone and everyone is going to go through the criminal justice system the same way without understanding the historical context of our nation, how people have been treated differently based on race, right? And then if you take that particular theory and you think about other aspects of society, like education, like health disparities, our criminal justice system, our housing, and financial inequality and disparities, we can really take a lens of thinking about race, racism, anti-Blackness across history, society, and cultural modes of expression. We want to understand how victims of systemic racism are affected by cultural perceptions of race and how they are able to present themselves to counter the prejudice, right? So for me, I study, I'll use myself as an example, I study leadership. I study undergraduate leadership theories. How do students come to college, engage in leadership, take something from it, and then go out into the world, right? And when I start to look at that, I'm looking at these white men that develop these theories based on only undergraduate white student perspective, in some ways privileged financially, economically, in other ways, and then try to apply that to present day students who we know majority of students in undergraduate education are students of color. That is problematic, right? And I need to take a step back and say, well, what is problematic about trying to do something that didn't take these students' experience into account from a historical point of view, and then try to apply it to present day? Same thing can be said in all aspects of our fields of education. And when we think about placing race at the center of analysis, we get to interrogate policies. We get to interrogate practices. We get to really think critically about, does this apply to all students? In what ways has it not applied to all students, right? Does it apply to all educators? In what way does it not apply to all educators, right? Do all of our students experience a law or a curriculum designed the same way, right? Can we really interrogate through a lens of analysis when we center race and the disparities of racial disparities and racial inequalities? I welcome any of my colleagues to jump in.
In terms of classroom perspectives, focusing on the knowledge that we bring, and I think Dr. Beatty just touched upon an excellent point in terms of the practicality, and I think for educators in terms of those who are in classrooms and thinking about who writes the text and the curriculum that we teach to our students, and that being another section of intersectionality in terms of the items and materials that are presented in terms of telling the story of race, of economic development, of the legal situations that have kind of occurred. How does that impact the mindset and the curriculum pieces that we're developing? I think from the research perspective, how do we unpack that? How are we going about looking at that intersection of how it impacts the curriculums that are being taught throughout our school system? I think also thinking about in terms of the dialogue that's been had about teaching critical race theory in our schools. I think one of the spinoffs of that theory and of that development has been from the teacher standpoint of culturally relevant practices, universal design. And so not necessarily this title of critical race theory, but also how do we unpack that in terms of what are we doing in our school system to look at that level and that lens of instruction that we're providing, thinking about history of school and history of education, Dr. Schwartz, and how that's developed. And if we're still using those same practices and those same frameworks, are we providing the avenues to truly unpack and for students to understand that perspective? And then in terms of our research, what are we doing to investigate those items and ensure that students in the classrooms have those types of experience moving forward?
So one thing that I think that critical race theory does, as you know, my colleagues have mentioned, is bringing racial inequity and other forms of inequity to the core of our discussion, whether it's about teaching, whether it's about practice, whether it's about research. So it's not that, so if we look at other frameworks that are available to talk about inclusion and exclusion, they might talk about inclusion and exclusion, but as a separate subject. So what critical race theory is saying is that let's bring it to the center of everything that we're doing. And what that means is that kind of reframing our ways of thinking and our ways of looking at topics that might not seem relevant to the issue of racial inequity. So it's basically saying that this is or should be the foundation or one of the foundations of our thinking. So that's not merely adding to something that we're already doing, but it's kind of rethinking the ways we do things. And I think when we go to discussing the pieces of legislation, we see that there is a lot of resistance to that, right? Though it's very clear that there's no clear understanding on their behalf of what critical race theory is. But there is an understanding that this framework aims to bring these conversations to the center. It is a way of reframing our ways of thinking and our ways of doing things. And that's why we think that there is such a strong resistance to it, though there is no clear understanding of what it is.
The other piece of that, there are tenets to CRT, and one of them is really thinking about that racism is endemic in a country, a settler colonial country. Racism is endemic, like all of my colleagues have named, in all aspects of society. And if you can't agree with that, then it's hard to go further with the analysis of thinking about critical race theory.
Another piece that we'll kind of mention later on in our presentation is the idea of courageous conversation. And I think these types of dialogues, as we're talking to unpack for educators and practitioners, as we're doing the work and having these discussions, it takes a lot of courage. I think one of the disenfranchisement that we've had is that we have not had the dialogue. We have not opened up the forefront to have. And again, I think in K through 12, it has to be the right time, the right maturity level. There are pieces that you have to ensure that are in place. The culture and climate is there. But this generation of learners is very different now than we may have had in the past. And so engaging them in those conversations in a safe environment to where we get perspectives from different backgrounds to where we can further understand why perspectives are the way they are and the impacts that they have had that others may not realize how that impacts somebody in terms of microaggressions and things that are said and done that may be offensive or taken a certain way, but if you never engage in the work and you say, oh, that's for someone else to do or to get done later, we never make the progress. And I think that's been one of the things that has stifled some of our understanding in terms of why we see the legislation we have. Many of the ones who are writing it did not have that experience. And so I have this framework that I was groomed in, that I was educated in, that becomes my only way of work. I have not reached out to find out about these different perspectives that exist in terms of how race has played a part in our legal system, development of our educational system, and these other facets that we engage in that we just take as the norm. And so questioning and looking at what is the reason behind, what is the reason behind, we don't have research dealing with Black males in undergraduate studies. We don't have anyone in the work, in the field, in the positions, you're not going to have it. And so how do we begin to unpack those pieces becomes important as we move forward.
If I might add just one thing that you said about microaggressions, that how critical race theory tries to reframe the discourse about intentionality. Mm-hmm. That this was not my intention. I am not racist. Mm-hmm. So kind of connecting that intentionality to systemic racism. And again, saying that if we accept that racism is endemic, it is in the foundations of the institutions that we work in and work with and in the society, then how can we be above that? So it is not merely individual intentionality, but it is how our intentions are conditioned, how our ways of thinking are conditioned. So I think it's kind of a step away from that, or kind of reframing the conversation.
It really separates the dichotomy of I'm racist or I'm not racist, right? And if you're stuck on I'm racist or I'm not racist, and getting called racist, that's some tension in the body, right? You could be as progressive or as liberal or as inclusive as you would like to be. And if that is like somebody calls you on an action or a microaggression, that's triggering, right? And it's because we've been made to think that either you can be racist or you can be not racist and not really examine the actions or the system in which racism and racist acts get perpetuated and upheld.
This next slide, more information in terms of some of the spinoff and some of the pipelines that critical race theory, and we had the one at the top in terms of critical legal studies. This was the original piece of critical theory that started in terms of looking at the legal system. You had a group of minority attorneys who were trying to file certain motions in the court system, and they found that it was difficult for them to do so. And so that began to look at how is my race playing a role in the legal system that I am working in. And from there, you have things like spatial theory that looks at the geography of places. So looking at how are our geographic locations and populations distributed, and are there reasons for that? Are there reasons why this demographic group or this set of individuals live in these areas, and to why? Looking at critical policy studies in terms of how legislation and policies come to pass, and how they impact different races and different groups throughout our country and throughout our state. Critical Black theory, Latino critical race theory, Asian critical theory, queer theory, critical tribal studies. These are all different aspects of critical race theory that have that connection to these original studies that become part of the work in terms of moving forward. I think looking at and hearing the different diversity of backgrounds that we have in the room and the backgrounds that we share in terms of looking at how these intersect to move us forward. And so we included some references to those as well. We talked a little bit about this already in terms of those intersection pieces. And so the factors that neither mutually exclusive or additive, but rather intertwine or intersect to create complex situations. Also thinking about the last bullet in terms of positionality of power was something else that we talked about in terms of how that impacts and intersects with the perceptions of critical race theory, and understanding these social justice constructs within our society in order to help challenge the status quo and look at these things to unpack them in terms of how we move forward. And so it's not this piece of information or this theory that's in isolation, but there's so many different intersections in terms of how it crosses over into so many areas that we might not always consider as part of our day-to-day work and practice. Legislative updates. And so we also wanted to connect in. So we've done a little bit of discussion and shared information regarding the theory. And so thinking about where we are now in the state of Florida and looking at some of the legislation that's coming, we wanted to share some of that information. Many times we hear about, hey, they're doing this, or hey, this thing has come out, but we never actually look at what it says. And so we wanted to also have some dialogue about what that legislation currently is framed within, and then how do we move forward from there.
We got to read the law.
So one thing that we wanted to do, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, that we wanted to become familiar with the content of the policies themselves. But we also wanted to look at the language of the policy. What is the language that is used? In addition, we also wanted to see the discourse that is built around the policy. For example, what kind of rationale is used to articulate the nature and goals of the policy itself. And then finally, what are some of the stated goals, and what we think are some of the implicit agenda that is really embedded in it. So we would be trying to situate our discussion around that. So, the first piece of legislation that was signed into law in June of 2021 was required instruction planning and reporting. And Florida State Board of Education adopted a rule that banned the teaching of critical race theory in K-12 schools. And I would invite my colleagues to join in here because I have not worked in K-12 schools, but my understanding is, having just read some reflections around it, that critical race theory is not really taught as critical race theory in K-12 schools. So it's just very interesting that they're banning something that is not taught with that name. So there's no course or anything like that that is called critical race theory. So in Florida, Education Association opposed the addition of this rule. And the interesting thing is that the Florida law already requires schools to provide instruction on areas such as Declaration of Independence, the Holocaust, and African American history. But the question here was, so this rule is added to this law that requires Florida schools to teach about Holocaust and to teach about the contribution of African American communities and their word Hispanic communities. But the question is how race should be discussed in classrooms, right? So the policy language, if you look at the policy language, what they have used in the policy, the language itself is efficient and faithful teaching of the required topic. So banning of critical race theory is defined as efficient and faithful teaching of the content. Again, it is connected to this idea of factual and objective teaching. And very interestingly, it is connected to recognizing the contributions of women, African Americans, and Hispanic people. So you can see there that how this is a very interesting and complex kind of a law, which is really presented as something that is meant to recognize the contributions of communities that are considered disadvantaged.
I was gonna say, I think this also, I think we'll look at the next slide, some of the details of that, but this speaks about dispositionality in terms of the legislation dictates how the curriculum is being taught in order to maintain the systems that are there, if that makes sense. And so there are systems in place, there's curriculum in place for teaching African American history, for teaching about civil rights movements. It's there already. And now it's saying you cannot utilize other strategies to teach from a different perspective of how those events played out. And so going back to textbooks and how curriculum is written and what that looks like from a publishing standpoint, I know that this is the legislation that's in place. If I'm writing a publishing textbook, I'm not going to go back and look at the perspective by which these stories are being told and or how they're written. So it also dictates for publishing companies that are producing literature to be used in classrooms what they're able to use as references in terms of if they want to continue to be successful or continue to have these partnerships. If I'm McGraw-Hill and I have these directives that say thou shall not, then I'm going to keep telling the story from the same perspective. And I'm not going to branch out to speak to individuals from different populations that may have a different perspective to write the curriculum that's being used in our class.
And they don't hide it. It's right there in the policy, 5th line down, as already provided.
Right. And another thing that we were discussing was that how many researchers, students and faculty and other researchers would step back from focusing on something that is related to racial inequity or any form of inequity, because they don't want to get into that issue of their research not being approved by our IRB at K-12 level and all of that. So if we read the language of the law, again, mentioning factual and objective and may not suppress or distort significant historical events. So another thing we noticed was that the term distortion has been used over and over again by the governor and as well as other policymakers and legislators to articulate the need for all of these laws. So that is certainly becoming the lens through which they are talking about it. And then examples of theories that distort historical events are inconsistent with state board approved standards include the denial or minimization of the Holocaust and the teaching of critical race theory. So you can see the juxtaposition, right? The denial of Holocaust, and then the next is teaching of critical race theory that is also denying some kind of a factual truth. Meaning the theory that racism is not merely the product of prejudice, but that racism is embedded in American society and its legal systems in order to uphold the supremacy of white persons. I guess they do understand what critical race theory is, right? So they might not be able to give references, but they understand what that means, right? So they have separated it very clearly here that we are going to connect it to the intentions of people, which are very hard to prove or disprove, but we're not going to look at the institutional and systems level. So they don't really specify anything else which can be considered critical race theory, but they do mention 1619 Project. And I don't know how many of you have heard about it. This is a New York Times Magazine project that was founded by Nicole Hannah Jones. basically that, one thing that she says that is the first thing on the website of that project is our democracy's founding ideas were false when they were written. Black Americans have fought to make them true. So it's retelling of the US history and present in terms of making slavery and other racialized practices, laws, and culture being the center of that conversation. So it's not something that is separate, but that is at the center of it. So that is something that is explicitly banned from the schools, and I guess that says a lot about the value. Okay, so and I think this is about it. So the basic question I think in this law is US a fundamentally racist country, according to this 1619 project. The second, anything else? So the second piece of legislation is called Intellectual Freedom and Viewpoint Diversity Assessment. And please notice the language there, right? Intellectual freedom and diversity assessment, viewpoint diversity assessment. It was again signed into law by Governor in June 2021. The policy language includes freedom and diversity and stopping indoctrination. So that was repeated over and over again. The governor said when signing it, we obviously want our universities to be focused on critical thinking, academic rigor. We do not want them as basically hotbeds for stale ideology. So what is part of this law? So you must have received these emails about a student being allowed to record instruction, and there are certain parts of it that they cannot share it without instructor's permission, all of that. So that is part of this legislation. So that one is here that the Board of Governors is expected from shielding certain students, faculty, or staff from certain speech. So this is defined in terms of shielding faculty, that the law would no longer shield students and faculty and staff. Part of it is this annually assessing intellectual freedom and viewpoint diversity at certain institutions. And so what does that mean? That means that the State Board of Education requires each Florida college system institution to conduct an annual assessment of the intellectual freedom and viewpoint diversity at that institution. The State Board of Education shall select or create an objective, nonpartisan, and statistically valid survey to be used by each institution, which considers the extent to which competing ideas and perspectives are presented, and members of the college community, including students, faculty, and staff, feel free to express their beliefs and viewpoints on campus and in the classroom. And then they're supposed to publish the assessment by September 1 of each year, beginning September 1st, 2022. So you can see that requires our higher education institutions, all the members of the higher education institutions, to fill out a survey about their beliefs.
We should ask, what would be problematic about that?
You mean what are they trying to disrupt, or why would it be problematic to implement?
Why would it be problematic to implement?
Well,
it's already passed.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's problematic because you are essentially saying don't teach critical race theory, and critical race theory is an expression of equal beliefs and viewpoint on campus. I don't understand how they expect this to not perpetuate the need for critical race theory to address the actual inequity that exists. I'm sorry, it's not what you're asking, right?
So my question is, who fills out the survey? Right, like if you're happy with how things are happening, probably not going to fill it out. But if you are unhappy or see something you don't like, you're more likely to fill out the survey. So it's potentially going to be biased against this theory.
And are faculty going to be required to complete it as a form of employment or other aspects of it?
I was wondering what financial implications would have on the outcome side.
In terms of student or
from state government.
So So saying, would they keep funding if our university was found to be too liberal? Okay. Which is one point of what are they doing with the information, right? We're going to post something on September 1st, and that's all we're going to do. I think we all are intellectually a little bit more critical than that, right?
Surveillance and just the idea that increased surveillance, increased intellectual freedom seems really counterintuitive.
And are people going to answer honestly?
Yeah, I mean, what are we going to do, as Dr. Beatty is saying, with the results? So let's say if it shows that the campuses are predominantly quote unquote liberal.
I would argue against that, but that's just my perspective.
But let's say if that happens. That's true. So then what is going to happen? Would there be a need to bring more diversity? Like just the definition of diversity is so interesting here, that freedom and diversity. And then they define what intellectual freedom and diversity means in the law. It means the exposure of students, faculty, and staff to, and the encouragement of their exploration of a variety of ideological and political perspectives. And I remember this comment that I received from someone in my class, that you're saying that, you know, we should be open to all points of view. Why don't you teach white supremacy too? That is another point of view. And I said, well, that's what we have been teaching for a very long time. So I don't think we need to be explicit about it. But so I think those kind of arguments we will continue to receive.
If I can just make a point really quick. If you look at this, just how it reads, anybody have an issue with it?
I think, isn't that critical race theory? I mean, to a certain extent, aren't they saying, like, let's consider, I mean, we're going to consider all perspectives except for critical race theory?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And the issue becomes who implements it and how, right? If you look at this and you're like, okay, if Dr. Beatty was to take this, I hope you would trust me with what this would look like, right? But we know that people that are driving it through or implementing it have ulterior motives, just given their own speech, right? I don't think I'm making anything up, just given what they've shared in the state legislature about the intentions around this, then that becomes the issue of how it's implemented. And that's not really spelled out, right? So then we need to ask some more questions. Okay, sorry. Let me get off my state.
Okay, so there's a new legislation proposal, and I have to thank one of our students who's here, Madeline, who's our master's student, who drew our attention to it. So this is presented now, it's a House bill, and this basically asks for banning the teaching of critical race theory in higher education. So one of the
it's currently in committee.
In committee, yeah. So one of the person who proposed it, who's representative, said that a ban on using critical race theory, this is a statement from him, in training policy of more public schools, colleges, and universities. The ban also extends to state agencies, county and municipal governments, and private contractors working with the government. So the language of the bill is that it prohibits state agencies, counties, municipalities, and public K-20 education institutions from providing mandatory training for employees or students which espouses certain concepts, requires certain diversity and inclusion efforts, requires DMS in consultation with Florida Commission on Human Relations to review agency diversity and inclusion training, requires contracts with agency to include option to terminate if contractor provides workforce training that espouses certain concepts, requires contractor to submit certification, requires each agency to report violations, authorizes contractors' placement on discriminatory vendor list. And this is the link to the full bill. And the language itself is not, at least this part is not using the term critical race theory, but when you go to the bill, it actually shows one of the things that it aims to ban. The language is something like racism is endemic to the US society, or US is fundamentally a racist country. So it's very clearly and explicitly stated that critical race theory would not be taught. And in their statements, they said that we want to ban the teaching of critical race theory. So these are the 3 pieces of legislation. 2 have been passed, have become a law, and I think they've been challenged in the courts too. And this is in the committee right now.
Reactions?
It's just interesting they use, I know that Khurshid mentioned the full bill does say critical race theory, but here there's certain concepts. I just feel like,
I just wrote that down.
like, how do you, like, I guess certain concepts, do you mean like?
It doesn't say who gets to define what concepts are, right?
I thought it would be a, sub-bullet saying what is certain concepts.
It does give examples.
It
but,
does give examples.
But it's up to interpretation, right? Or, this week it's CRT, next week it might be Black feminist thought, right? Like we get to pick and choose what the certain concepts are.
Right.
Yeah.
We as in not us.
I also want to mention, so Randy Fine is a representative who introduced this bill. When he was interviewed by his local popular press, his response was, critical race theory is racist at its core and has no place in the state of Florida. The notion that people are good and bad based on the color of their skin runs counter to everything our country is founded on. It is insidious, it is evil, and it's propagated to make our children hate their country. As we have seen in Brevard County, radical politicians and bureaucrats are indoctrinating this hate into our principals, teachers, and ultimately students.
What do we do about it?
Yeah.
I think going back to some of our initial points about just the history of critical race theory in terms of how it starts with the legal system. It goes back to some of those core pieces in terms of these are mechanisms by which we continue to stay in the same vein and repeating almost history. If I can change the law to say, hey, here's how we need to teach and educate our students, our faculty, this is what we're going to allow, then we perpetuate the cycle of status quo. And then when we have social unrest and social injustice issues, we're at this, have these indoctrinated tensions of not discussing the issues at hand. So these become those avenues by which we continue. I think for our field in terms of education, we have a lot of power in terms of what we can do if we collectively bring those things together and look at how do we continue to have these dialogues and these discussions about this history and about what this means for our students moving forward to where we try to slowly tinker toward improvement, but it is a process.
We have a comment in the chat from Leah. It seems like it's asking people to tattletale on each other. It reminds me of a bill in Arizona that would fine teachers for speaking on controversial subjects. And a second from Raquisa, apologize if I mispronounced the name. Does this sound like the whole Red Scare situation with their discriminatory vendor list and people turning each other in?
And we talked about that, I think, with our discussion about the last one with the vendors that are coming in. And so then you have legislation that says, if you're doing this, then we don't have to use you, and then you can't sue us for not using you. If you have vendors that are coming in to provide these types of services, now they are blackballed or blacklisted because of their approach to certain things, as well as some of the research behind the publication and things that they're producing. So we begin to kind of continue to perpetuate that same cycle. Sean.
Oh, just adding on, how do they purport to resolve this sort of political philosophical tension between, imposing the centralized ideological planning is very distinct from the usual to let the market resolve and stabilize itself. It seems totally contradictory to the core philosophical values.
It's very interesting. They're saying that there's no racism in the country, but if you talk about critical race theory, that there is racism in the country. So it's like, it's I think embedded in it that it is working fine. The market capitalist neoliberal system is working fine, but your critical race theory is actually hindering the working of the fair and free and efficient capitalist.
And you all have pointed out many contradictions across all 3 bills. And there's a lot of, this new buzzword, right? There's a lot of gaslighting with the word diversity, inclusion, right? Discriminatory. We have a discriminatory vendors list, meaning the vendor is discriminatory because they're using critical race theory, right? These are gaslights in the sense of, this is an inclusive policy. This is getting at the core of what we say we want about diversity, right? When really, it's really contradicting the point that they're making with a ban on critical race theory.
On a grander scale, because this might be the very about getting the policy or specific policy, but it looks also at how you muzzle people, how you take that the essence of US democracy and freedom of expression, and then you put a mask on it, muzzle it, and it becomes so ironic because it's contradicting what Sean is saying, that they made the principle of democracy is founded on freedom of expression. But yet insidiously, one by one, you're putting in these policies, making them law, and you're shutting down little by little. It's what the US has gone into other countries to do to save democracy, to save the, but it's happening here. You know that how it, you know, if you're not careful, if you don't have these kinds of conversations, then you're not aware of what is happening until it hits you. It hits you all of a sudden. And you know the conversation is necessary to be able to see some of these things happening, you know, little by little.
People who come from other parts of the country, like myself, we have been saved so many times, right? You know, you guys have gone in to save us so many times. So it's just interesting to see this happen. I think
yeah, I was wondering what your thoughts are on the previous executive order that we had about not doing training on diversity students, and then how that would affect financial means of whatever education institutions. And when that's been passed, is this another repackaging or repurposing of?
You're talking about the state level or the federal level? So I think it was a executive order that the previous president put in place for federal agencies. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Is my understanding, right? And that executive order is very vague in the sense of, you know, if I'm sitting in a training and I feel uncomfortable because you're telling me to say pronouns, I can report. That's how I can report that, right? And really thinking about what is diversity and inclusion training, and the way that I think that executive order kind of packaged it is even talking about diversity and inclusion is exclusion, right? And I think then after the election, these current state legislative cycles, we've seen that point, and then people have run with it with legislation around things like critical race theory. What's your question? I'm sorry, I didn't answer it.
Yeah, I was just wondering if, because that failed, are folks finding new ingenious methods to come back with more bang through these kind of outfits?
Yeah, so it's no longer in place. I think that was one of the things that the new president retracted on day one. Executive order he retracted on day one. But that's not to say that it's not happening at the state it's exactly happening at the state legislature levels, like states like Texas. I think Nebraska has one. Like there's things happening all across the country at the state and local level. And I don't know. I have friends that are doing consulting work. I think some of them are just using different language. But I know because of the pandemic, a lot of obviously that has been halted, or what that looks like. I still think a lot of districts, and Dr. Small, correct me if I'm wrong, are still doing culturally responsive of teaching and other things. But I think the critical reflective part is, do we just use a different language and still try to do our work? But in some ways, do people win when they're trying to do things like this, right?
In one of his slides, there was a phrase that talked about certain universities. So the financial repercussions make certain institutions vulnerable. So these kinds of laws. What are we going? You're going first, if anything, after the public university.
What do they do if they administer this survey and it comes back with students saying, no, I don't feel that my position is being represented because I am part of a racially suppressed group and I am unable to, you know, act like that survey should enable people who have been repressed by traditionally racist policies to vent their concern. What happens if it breaks the survey? I'm so interested. Yeah, I'm just so interested.
I think there's an argument to be made that they won't stand up in court.
Yeah.
And so I do all three of them. And the question is, how does that play out? does somebody become the, is there a group of people who say, I'm going to be the people who push this forward? I mean, already you can see, so, very, very, very few teachers teach critical race theory, but, US history is taught across all these schools, and teachers can choose to be explicit or not. And there are some teachers that are getting identified in this way. So then this is going to become a court case. And the same thing for the faculty. I mean, what's going to happen? Are we going to fill this out? Are we going to refuse to fill it out? Are we going to, so I think that then if someone refuses to fill it out, then we get sued, the long and the short of it is, from what I've read, these things don't seem to hold in, won't hold up in court, but of course, we don't know. Yeah.
It reminds me because I remember when I first came to Florida, I was told that Florida state employees and public school teachers can't talk about climate change or global warming. And I wonder if anybody has been sued for using the word climate change in the classrooms.
I mean, as was said earlier, these go up against, the First Amendment. Yeah. So there's just huge contradictions.
And I do know that the new legislation is on the faculty union's radar and I believe the graduate student radar as well. And thinking about when the legislature session is in session, there was a bill that was supposed to pass. I think it was similar to this last session, and I think the faculty union were lobbying, and now it's back up. It's back around.
I'm a reviewer for the Presidential Award for Excellence in Math and Science Teaching for the NSF. 2 of the 5 categories of excellence in teaching are specifically adapted to culturally responsive education and supporting diverse opinions in class. Like I can't even, I'm sorry, I'm done.
So where do we go from? So we've kind of unpacked a lot of different pieces. And so there's another link for a Padlet discussion. I think there are 4 questions on there that we put in the chat, I believe, for our face. Zoom participants. But if you have a device, we'll open this up, I think, in terms of where we want to go and kind of doing the work. All right. 3 questions that we have posed for us to kind of chew on and begin collecting feedback. And so this, by simply clicking the plus sign, you can add a comment there. But the question that we pose: what are the current issues you are facing in research or practice related to today's topic? And so part of kind of our outcome piece is looking at where do we go from here. And so trying to collect some of that feedback and information from our audience as well as those who are tuning in on how does this impact? Are there any issues that I'm currently facing in terms of doing my research? Am I using one of these critical frameworks and I am having some anxiety about if it's going to get approved through some of the channels that I have to go through? Am I a practitioner and facing some pushback from my school principal or from my district or from my educational institution in terms of looking at these lenses? What resources or supports do you need or would be helpful from ELPS, i.e. coursework or research advisement? What are some of the things that we could do to help in terms of navigating? So collecting some feedback there. Suggestions for how the institution, i.e. our department, college, university, should respond. And so is there any feedback on how you would like to see us respond as a unit, as a university, as a department to these types of legislation? And then any other factors or items that you'd like for us to consider. And so those are 4 separate questions that we're gonna give you a few minutes to kind of respond to. And then our plan is to utilize this to kind of further the work in terms of where we go from here. We'll talk about our timeline as well, but we're hoping to use some of the commentary from today, of course, information from here, to develop a kind of official follow-up survey to collect some official data to use that moving forward. Anybody need the link again? Yeah, capture the link. So we'll send the link out as well. I know this may take some processing or something as well. Somebody's ready to hack. Kind of, I'm just gonna chime in on the ones about in terms of instruction. Again, I don't have all the answers. But there's a comment in terms of how do we address this in classrooms, thinking about what can teachers do, the way that teachers inside schools are discussing and collaborating. How do we address this further as our principals directing teachers? That's huge. And again, there's not going to be a solid answer on how that's done. I think that as educators, it becomes part of our job to think critically about the curriculum that we're using. And although each district has a process in terms of what they're adopting and that process of selecting from vendors, I think as educators and as we're preparing teachers to go into workforce, preparing them to think critically about, hey, what does this list of resources speak in terms of my perspective on things? And many times we find that a lot of the list of resources that are used come from a single or 2 to 3 sources and perspectives of information. So as an educator, as a teacher, how do I diversify my lens and my toolbox of resources and perspectives that speak to the different lenses by which people see things, and bring in those types of things? And so I think from principal perspective, how do you support your teachers in identifying those gaps. And so, hey, we've adopted this curriculum. Here's what we're supposed to teach about the civil rights movement. Does it give a diversity of perspectives on how that's carried out, and not just utilizing those specific events like the civil rights movement, but what are those other pieces that have taken place in history that they may not be aware of that aren't captured in my textbook? And so how do I bring those things to the table as a successful educator who's equipped to bring those in? I think many times for social studies and history teachers, they rely on either their own history of, hey, this is what I learned about it, and this is how I'm going to teach it, and or here's what's been adopted. And so we have to move beyond that in terms of reframing our instructional practices. And as leaders, how do we ensure that we're supporting teachers who are looking at these various ways of providing that instruction? So that just kind of captured some of my attention in terms of the instructional piece. I think at the graduate level and collegiate level, exposing our students to those different perspectives. And so it doesn't necessarily require you to hammer critical race theory into your students, but how do you expose them to these concepts to where if they haven't had it before, how do I include it and bring that into a dialogue of the different perspectives that are there for that discussion, and at least educate them on implications of how race has impacted our legal system, our health and wellness system, geography, and those types of things. Otherwise, we lend ourselves to continuing with that single line of that single story and having that single perspective.
Or having alumni that contribute to legislation that blocks the
So a lot of information here. We'll share this as well. Again, this is not going to be the end all be all, but we want to continue the dialogue. We're also going to put together a resource pack of information that we've kind of used in developing today. And so in terms of next steps and moving forward, and so expect a follow-up and or survey information kind of that lends itself to some of the information that we've collected today, as well as some perspectives from that. We're going to also include an option for focus groups. If you're interested, there'll be some information in that survey to, the survey will be anonymous, but we'll have a segment of the survey that will collect your information if you're interested in participating in the focus group. I think that qualitative data will be very important as well in terms of looking at how are we perceiving some of the things that are taking place in research and practice. And then we're hoping to report back and do a follow-up conversation R3 in the month of January, where we utilize the information that we collected. Last year, we did the student climate survey as well. And so utilizing and triangulating a lot of these data points to kind of move forward. But again, this is not a one-time shot kind of conversation. I would encourage, and I'm sure colleagues would encourage as well, continue to engage in the work and having these conversations with your network of peers in terms of seeking understanding. I think you have to also be very vulnerable in terms of what I don't know, what I'm not familiar with, what I'm not comfortable talking about, because I haven't had that dialogue, but it's okay. And so as long as you have those ground rules in terms of those courageous conversations, you benefit on both sides. And so there are things that we can all learn from each other in terms of perspective. We have to open that dialogue for discussion. In terms of references, again, we'll include this in our conversation as well, and then our contact information. Feel free to email us for further communications or information, or if you have questions about anything. We've done a lot of just research in terms of digging, and so the reference list is shortened. And so if there are materials that you want to look at, I know I have a segment in 2 of my courses that deal with critical race theory that I have some articles that I pulled. And so if we can be of any assistance in terms of providing access to that, definitely let us know. But we'll have a resource pack that we're hoping to get loaded to the website as well, of just further readings and information that may be helpful in your personal journey as well as your professional journey.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for the last slide to identify that this isn't a one-off, right? This was something to kind of give you the history of it. The very first faculty meeting, when we all meet together, right, when school starts, we realized this was an issue we needed to talk about as a faculty. And we agreed that, you know, at least I'm the kind of person that wants to come out with the answers to everything, right? That we would wait until the spring to come out and have a definitive presentation. We give you all the answers about everything about race, right? Then we realized it's okay, we all don't know all the answers. So we're taking at this iterative process that our 3 colleagues here who are leading and doing a fantastic job in doing so. The email that went out from me, from the department on Monday, that again from me yesterday, had a quick little Qualtrics survey. It just asks your email address. What I do is I'd ask you to fill that out, because that's where we can use your contact information to get you involved in the focus groups if you'd like to participate in this research. We'll also send information out for the department writ large, and we're working on updating the R3 website right now. So I want to express the sentiment that I know it's on the chat. Thank you, many times over on this excellent session. The thing that I will close with, and then we'll open up to any other questions. I'm sure feel free to talk to any of our panelists. Our next R3 will be in 2 weeks, topic yet to be determined. In 4 weeks, however, our very own brand new faculty member, Alonzo Gildine, will be speaking with us, where the topic will be storytelling in research. So I'll get more information about that. That'll be in 4 weeks in this room. And again, I just want to thank you all for coming. And once again, thank you guys. This was fantastic. I think it's exactly what we needed. And I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation over the next year.
Okay. Thank you.